And every so often you get somebody who will say, don't you feel kind of badly writing about all these people? And, when I use Anne Lamott's, I think, quote in Bertie Bird, if people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. And I used to have that up right
So good.
at the start.
Down in the valley, moved up from the city. It's a new way of living and I'm trying to get used to it. 1 park coolers, half an ounce of an idiot. Ordered a Manhattan and they call me a Cidiot. At first I hurt my feelings, but it's kinda got a ring to it. When you move to the country, they can tell when you're new to it. I'm looking at a place, but I'm trying to keep fitting in. It takes too long to be a local, so for now I'm a Cidiot.
I'm Matt Zucker, and this is Cidiot, learning to live and love life in the Hudson Valley. You can't visit or live in the Hudson Valley without being 10 degrees from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A former governor of New York, his roots, as well as the roots of his wife Eleanor, run deep, especially in Dutchess County, where we lived until recently. Our 32nd president is unique in many ways, including having been elected 4 times, though he died early in his last term in 1945. On my Dutchess County Tourist Ambassador quiz, which, yes, I aced, there were at least 4 different questions related to the FDR Historic Site in Hyde Park. And it's not just him, also Eleanor. Back in episode 27, I did an episode called Eleanor Was Right, which timed with the dedication of a bronze bust of Eleanor in our village of Tivoli, where she once lived. Thanks to Jen and Jen of the Valley Girls podcast, I was introduced to historian and writer A.J. Schenkman, who writes a lot about area history, has multiple books including Patriots and Spies, Wicked Ulster County, Washington's headquarters in Newburgh, and recently, Franklin's Trees. His brand, as he says, is History Made Seamless. It's about bringing history to life and showcasing the regular folk and how things were. In this episode, we talk about AJ's story, Valkill, the only National Historic Site dedicated to a First Lady, and his new children's book, Franklin's Trees. And we also talk about being a witness. Not just witness trees, which is a thing, but witness to history, and feeling like maybe those characters from the past were just there moments ago. Well, maybe because they were. Hi, AJ.
Hi, thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, it's so great to have an author on. Maybe a good place to start would be your relationship with the Hudson Valley. Are you from here? Did you move here?
I'm originally from another valley. I'm from the Queens Valley, which is near Flushing, and I came from Kew Garden Hills, which is in the hills of Kew Gardens. But I had family up here. I had an aunt and uncle. I had a grandparents who lived around here. And plus my father used to take us camping and we'd end up in Hyde Park and we'd go camping in Mills Norrie State Park. Plus my father's family had a summer house when he was a kid on Bullet Hole Road. And my mom had moved up here when she was a little girl and lived in Mayapack. And they were originally all from the Bronx and Brooklyn and all those great places. So I've been coming up here for a while. And then I relocated to Boston. And then my mom was passing away. And I decided I was going to go to college in New Paltz. I always had the vision of, ending up somehow back up in New England. But there's an old legend that if you swim in the Wallkill, you're destined to die in New Paltz. So
I did not know that.
yes, and I fell out of a canoe right where the Wallkill and the Shongamgill meets. So I got a baptism, so I've been here ever since. And that's probably around 1990, 91.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I grew up in Jersey. We didn't really come up here. we knew about the Berkshires. People would go skiing there, and we would go to like Jewish summer camp in the Poconos. But I really didn't know about this area. I just didn't know until my in-laws moved up here.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a beautiful area, and I've watched it change a lot. I used to go to Minnewaska Park. It used to close at like 4 o'clock, or it wasn't even open on the weekdays sometimes. So you'd just be able to just go in and there were no lines. But as people discover the area, as I did, it also becomes really important to people to preserve it, which is really nice.
Yeah, it is. And also I never appreciated the deep history. You're a writer, but you're also a historian, and I'm really interested in history, both recent and very, very far away, about where I am and what happened around where I was. And I just keep stumbling across things in the Hudson Valley about revolutionary history, about, even a century earlier, but I don't always know where to go for like some interesting answers and stuff besides like Wikipedia.
Yeah, which I tell my students is only first because of algorithms, but it's not always the best. And they
Right.
go, you use it for? And I said, well, check out sources. Where are they getting some of these sources from? But even when I was, a firefighter, I was a firefighter at like, a company I've been around for a long time with people who had been living in the area forever and a day. And I mean, and their stories were just awesome. I remember helping put out a fire, this huge house, and it was the Pearly Decker house. And so I said, well, Pearly Decker, okay? And they look at me and they go, Pearly Decker, man, she's been dead for 200 years. And I said, why call it the Pearly Decker house? He said, because it's Pearly Decker's house. What are we going to call your house? The Schenkman house? It's the Sherman house. And they used to remember when this was this and that was that. And it's just really was a lot of fun. I'm talking to a lot of the older firefighters, especially about houses that weren't there anymore, that had been, knocked down or redone or they burned.
Wait, did you get into history because of architecture, or like how did you get into
I was one of those people. I was always into history, but I didn't realize it. I always wanted to impress my parents, and so I wanted to be a lawyer or a doctor. So then, I found music and I got into music. And then I remember when I was still pursuing that, a professor just said to me, what are you doing here? You just seem to be, anytime you get a chance, you're you're reading a history book. And I really fell in love with history because my aunt and uncle lived up here, and they lived in a house from the 1840s. And I researched that house down to the doorknobs. So it just seemed, and even when I volunteered at the only working farm left in Queens. It was a Dutch homestead. When I came up here, I was working at New Windsor Cantonment. So it was just a good fit. And the writing I've been doing forever. Like my first rejection from Saturday Night Live, I sent it there, my own jokes with, about Gilda Radner and stuff like that. And they sent it back and said, we really appreciate this, but we are not allowed to take unsolicited material. So I just was always looking to write. Even in school, I just enjoyed it so much, but I was more into creative writing than historical writing at that point.
Well, I was looking at your blog though, and I see that you cover a whole bunch of different things that I like too, like covered Claremont, and you wrote Wicked Ulster County.
The reason I like blogging now is because I can write about where my interests are. I find something interesting and I'm just like, well, hey, I found this interesting and maybe you will too. And in my reviews, a lot of people say that I give you just as much as you need. I don't get tedious. I don't get into crazy facts, and I still manage to make it very interesting. Like when parents meet me, they say, oh my God, now I know why my kid comes home and all they're doing is talking about you bring history alive. And a lot of the history that I look at is history of just common people. The blog post I'm getting ready to put up tomorrow, I call it How Hershey's Won World War II.
Yeah.
It's really, they didn't, but it's coming up with the D ration, where they needed a high energy, kind of, lack of better words, candy bar that would save somebody in a possible starvation situation. And it had to be very calorie dense, but we didn't want to make it so good that it's the first thing you would jump into. I mean, the real Hershey bars would sometimes be in your K rations, but it had to be 4 ounces. It had to be able to withstand high heat, but the soldiers couldn't eat it. They were so bitter, they'd have to use a knife to kind of scrape it. It was like hardtack. So they began just chucking it. But it's an interesting story about Hershey's. So I threw that up there. And then the way the whole Wicked thing got going is kids asking me stories. I had a real difficult Huskyador. It was part husky, part lab. So I was still getting up 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, feeding all the animals many years ago. And when I had nothing to do, I would just look up old newspapers. And I just started finding all these bizarre tabloid type stuff from local papers from like the 1880s, 1890s. And then I was reading about Billy the Kid, who was a homicidal maniac from, I think, Brooklyn. And I said to myself, there had to be like equal outlaws up here,
Yeah.
And so I began researching that. And then I was doing an in-service for school. And I think it was the then director of the Dorsey Museum at SUNY New Paltz. He said, "Oh my God, these are great stories." He said, "You should publish them, like create a book like Old Gangs of Ulster." I have some input and titles. That publishing company said, "This is what we'd like to do and fit it into a series." And that's what we did. And it continues to do very, very well. I mean, people want to hear about things like alligators in the Rondout or on the Hudson. And every so often you get somebody who will say, "Don't you feel kind of badly writing about all these people?" And, when I use Anne Lamott's, I think, quote in Birdie Bird, if people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. And I used to have that up.
So good.
Art. History is, has story in it. It's just a lot of good stories. And
Yeah, I love to know the Wicked all around me, wherever I am, because it is really fun and it does bring, I guess, history to life, like you said.
Oh yeah, as everyone likes a good story.
Well, your new one though is much nicer. Like it's not so wicked. So I'm reading Franklin's Trees, which is an illustrated book all about FDR and his love of trees, which I do like, but I don't understand trees because when they fall down on my house or on the neighbor's property and it's my insurance bill that gets hit and I have to pay for it. I've had to do that, but I do like trees and trees are important too. How did this one come about?
During COVID, during the lockdown, I think it was when we were allowed to kind of go out, but we had to social distance, that we rediscovered Valkill. And we began checking that out. And my son just said,
maybe explain what Valkill is for people.
Valkill is on Violet Avenue or 9G, which is in Hyde Park. And we used to always go to FDR's mansion, but we also used to go to Valkill quite a bit. And my son proclaimed one day that this was his happy place.
Oh.
And any time that I would try to cut any trees down or anything like that, or when we saw really beautiful trees there, he would always be drawn to them. And he was drawn to the sites. He was drawn to talking to the rangers. I think he was made a junior ranger at FDR's home. And I was originally writing about FDR and Warm Springs and how he won over the South. And then all of a sudden, this whole book about Franklin's trees kind of morphed into this. And my son helped me write it. Also, I read a story that in 1941, when Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who was Franklin's mother, died, that the largest oak on the property, on a clear, sunny day without any wind or rain the previous days or anything, came crashing to the ground. So every time you read about or you find stories about FDR, or even just walking around there, it's always trees. And one of his iconic pictures, he's in his Ford, which had all these different hand controls because he couldn't use his legs. He's right by a tree. And one of the reasons he got the hand controls happening is so he could go down Farm Lane and go to Valkill, where a lot of the trees were planted, and just be able to go down all the farm roads and the tree plantation. And even when he becomes president, he has a CCC, which, when he starts working on trees and conservation, and some of his most memorable quotes are about trees and about the Hudson Valley.
I'm a Dutchess County tourist ambassador, a pretty terrible one, but I'm supposed to really advocate for the FDR site and stuff, and I really don't really even know that much about it. So, yeah, his love for trees makes much more sense now for what he advocated.
And I believe that some of those trees are witness trees, meaning that
What does that
They've
mean?
been around since the time of FDR, and that he planted them.
Oh,
And
cool.
which is really cool. And I know some of the trees around Valkill and Stone Cottage are actually, they're witness trees. Eleanor would have known those trees in her time, which I always think is just as cool as a moose.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And did you know about trees or did you have to learn about them? At the back of the book, you've got a whole tree identification system.
I've always kind of been into that. I've always gone backpacking and I've always been very interested in stuff like that. At one point, I think I wanted to be a ranger, in the summers or volunteer, but it just never happened. So I've been backpacking for a long time. I backpacked in the Colorado Rockies. It's just, and I love trees. I get excited, seeing a moose. I get excited, seeing an elk, and all that great stuff.
I don't think I would know the difference between a moose and an elk. I'm gonna have to look that up.
One looks like a really big deer, and well, the other one looks like a moose. Their antlers are different. There's different colors. And when you're up in New England, sometimes you see them around dusk, licking the sides of the road because of all the salt that we put on the sides of the road in the winter.
Oh, they lick the
I
salt.
mean,
Wow.
they're huge. They're huge. A lot of times you'll see them like in a pond or something like that. They wanted to put elk up here a while ago, up in the Catskills, but it just never happened. And moose have trouble living down here because there's so many white-tailed deer. There's a disease they get, and it eats their brain away, and they just begin walking around in circles until they die. It's a horrible thing. But occasionally a moose will walk through. I think there was one in Dutchess County, and there's a sign that has moose crossing up in Phoenicia, but nothing like you would see like up in the Adirondacks or New England or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
wouldn't want to hit one.
No,
And they
no.
got a bad temper.
They do? They have a temper?
And during rutting season, they've got a bad temper.
Would they like run for you?
Yeah, they don't play games.
Wow. I'm already scared of coyotes and bears, and I'll add that. So part of being a Dutchess County tourist ambassador is you get points for when you go to different sites and you learn different history and stuff. And I'm way behind, and I'll probably have to take the test again because I'm so far behind in my points. But maybe, is there anything about the FDR site that would help me maybe get some points or something I don't know that I could share?
One of my favorite stories, it was told to me by a ranger and also an ex-ranger. And I know I'm going to get the story wrong, but in the early 80s, some electricians were working on the house. And later that night, it was very cold. I was in the winter. And so I'm not blaming the electricians, but part of the mansion caught fire.
Oh.
And they called the fire department. And just before they arrived, people that were associated with the site were running in to pull out stuff so it wouldn't get destroyed. And when the fire department arrived, it was so cold that when they were putting out the fire, if you know the big staircase, the water was freezing as it was sitting on the staircase. And it was a considerable amount of water damage. It was written up in the New York Times. So they finally got the fire out. People who worked there were taking turns going in and out of the house to make sure no one was trying to get in there. The fire wasn't rekindling. And one person reported that as they entered into the mansion, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, the mother of Franklin, was coming down the stairs and she says, "What are you doing in my house? Get the hell out." Which, I could picture her doing. I don't know if I would picture her using the word hell, but maybe she did. And that's also why Valkill came into being, was because Eleanor kind of wanted a place to kind of get away from the domineering spirit of Sarah. And she owned
Of her mother-in-law.
mother-in-law. She owned all the property. And in around 1911, FDR purchased this little area. I want to say it might have been part of the Bennett farm, if my memory serves me correctly. And that was the only part of land that he owned up until her death. And right where Stone Cottage is, Nancy and Marion, who were friends of Eleanor and Franklin's, they used to have a picnic right where the Stone Cottage is today. And so every fall, they'd have to, they'd say, "Oh, it's so sad. We can't be in our favorite place anymore." And when FDR at one point says, "Nonsense, why don't we just build a cottage?" So he got Henry Toombs to help him kind of design it. And a stone cottage was finally built in 1926. And then, of course, then you had Valkill Industries from 1926 to 1932. And then Valkill Cottage then became the centerpiece for Eleanor. But it was a place where she could grow and kind of become herself. And then FDR in 1938-39 had Top Cottage built up on Duchess Hill. So that's all the property that he owned. And when he died, Eleanor purchased like 800 acres of that property, and all that's left is like 250. And Valkill is the first site dedicated in the United States to a first lady, and I think that was around 1977. But the centerpiece is, it was a tree plantation. And across from Valkill Road was Moses Smith's home as well.
Moses Smith?
And he was a tenant for FDR. And Moses Smith was an old soldier from the Filipino War, and he was a close kind of informal political advisor to Roosevelt. He was like a common man. He didn't grow up in Hyde Park. He grew up in Cripplebush, which is out here, and his wife was from Accord. If you know Accord, I think the Reformed Church in Accord is where they were married. But one of my favorite stories is that FDR, he just would be driving down 9G, and he would just pull over right where he's called Moses' house was, his tenant house, and he would just talk to who's ever there. And then at one point he said, "Where's Mose?" And Mose, appeared out of the crowd, removed his hat, took his pipe out of his mouth. And after they got to talking a little bit, Mose put his finger like right up to FDR's nose, and he goes, "What I'm wondering there, young fella, is what all this talk about war." And FDR was with his forestry advisor. And then later on, as they were, driving back, he said, "Did you see how far Mose Smith had his finger, had my nose pushed in?" Which I thought was kind of funny.
That's great.
And the way that the site is made up is just, you're expecting these people just to come right out.
Do you have a favorite of these places that you like to go?
I really like the hike up to Top Cottage, but I really like Eleanor's walk. And that was her walk every morning, whether it was raining, whether it was snowing, whether it was muddy. She would walk there with Fala, which was FDR's dog, and another dog named Thomas. They were little Scotties.
Oh.
And it's interesting, that, Fala would see a squirrel and Fala and Thomas would just take off. And she says, and I wouldn't see them for days. Then she'd get a call. "Hi, we have Fala here. He slept overnight here. We'll return him to the FDR site." Or the FDR site would call up and say, "Hi, Eleanor, we have Fala here." So she had to figure out a way to kind of prevent them from always running off, because she was afraid something was going to happen. So she built a little kennel by Valkill, and she'd only take one out at a time, because when they were both together, they were very problematic. So I just picture her, walking there with all these heads of state. And, when I see one of these huge trees that I know is like 100 years old, I think about her looking at these and thinking, and, and even the wires that go across the right of way has been there since the 50s. So she would have known those wires. I tell my students that a primary source is an eyewitness account. It's the closest you're going to get to that account without really being there. And that's, for some reason, I feel like when I'm walking into FDR's home, for instance, he's just not home. It's just left as it is, but that's what he wanted. It's kind of stuck in 1941.
Yeah, I want to ask you advice for Cidiots who move here to just appreciate what's around them. Other people move from Queens or from Jersey, and they're here. They may not know the history. I wonder if the first piece of advice you would have given would have been to pay attention to what's around you and imagine what it was like for them. Try to see it. Try to be a primary source for a moment.
I think the thing that I fell in love about with up here, more than the city, I mean, when I was in Queens, there was a lot of history, but also a lot of it had been wrecked. You walk around here, it's just, I think of that Tom Petty song, Rebels, where he says that when he was walking around in town, he could see the blue-bellied devils wandering around at night behind trees and the buildings. I kind of think that, especially when I'm walking down Huguenot Street, you can see a lot of this stuff. And I mean, I think of the Jacob Hasbrook house.
Where's that? Poughkeepsie? Where?
This is on Huguenot Street. It was owned by Dick Hasbrook, who passed away a number of years ago. And it was the first time in 300 years that home had been out of the Hasbrook family. That's a lot of history. But even when I was buying my house, when I used to live in Kerhonkson, the owner of the house, before I bought it, said, hey, he goes, let me take you out back here. And he said, you see that? And I said, are those teeth? He said, yeah, those are teeth. And I said, they're dentures? He goes, yeah, they're dentures. They're my grandmother's dentures.
Yeah.
I said, how long have they been on this pole, pole out here? And he said, I don't know, since the 20s or 30s. And I said, well, what's the story behind it? He said, well, we were putting in a cesspool. We were putting in what would have been a water closet. And he said that grandma couldn't believe that when she flushed that toilet, everything was going to go down. And when she pulled the chain and looked down, he said part of her dentures fell out. And they flushed into the cesspool. He goes, my father and I were waiting around in that cesspool all day until we found them. He said, and what we did is we just put bleach on them. And he goes, and we gave him back to her. And she goes, I'm not putting those things in my mouth. And he goes, well, I can't afford to get your new ones. They'll be out here bleaching in the sun until you're ready. And she never did. And they've been sitting out there. And I mean, that's such a great story.
Hilarious.
It tells you a lot. And stories can also tell you what's important to people, their socioeconomics. And then to drive down the road and to know that all the electrical poles were put in by this guy's father, and everything's just like a web, and it all just comes together. And it's so cool. And I love that.
And it's right out there sometimes.
One of the things I was talking to my students about is that the thing that I also like about history is that when you are in history, when you're like, I don't remember the news show. I want to say it was like the Today Show or something like that, where someone was interviewing this photographer, and it was the war in Bosnia. And he had this picture of this cat, and you could see this cat running across a minefield, and the cat is terrified. And the newscaster said, oh my God, where can I get a copy of this picture? And he says, you can't. He goes, I own the negatives. This is the only copy. And he said, when the war is over, I'm destroying it all. And he goes, this is a work of art. He says, yes, but as long as this picture is here, this cat will forever be running. And I want it to lay down and rest. So it's not running forever. And that's kind of the way I look at it. A good book will transform you into time. And as you're getting through the book, you're getting angrier and angrier because it's coming to an end. So all of that is probably the reason that I write. And also to make, as my brand is, History Made Seamless, to make it accessible. Because when I was a kid, all you learned was history was facts. And not to be controversial, it was great men. And that was it. We didn't learn about all the people that made everything up. Like, I still remember this Japanese girl who was in one of the internment camps during World War II. And she walks up to a soldier and she says, and there are these turrets with machine guns in them. And even the soldiers patrolling are armed with their M1s. And she says, why are there machine gunners in those towers? And he said, that's to keep you safe. And she said, if it's to keep us safe, why are they faced inward? That's the power that I love about history, the little stories and writing about it, pulling you in, I guess.
What do you still want to tell? Like, what's your next thing?
I don't think I'm done with children's books yet. I think I'd like to write another children's book. I don't know on what, we're throwing around some ideas, but in 2025, I have a book coming out on Hispanic Americans in the Civil War. which just came by way of a student from South America in my class asking me questions about it. And also my demographics are changing in my district, and having children, Hispanic children, asking me or wanting to be included in American history and wanting to know about these things. So instead of saying, I don't know, why don't you look it up and get back to me, which is basically saying, don't ever ask me another question again, and punishing the kid with some work, some extra homework, or the whole class gets angry at him because you give it to the whole class as an assignment. I don't do things like that. But I quickly found out that the guy who said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, Admiral Farragut, he is the first U.S. admiral in U.S. Navy history, and he's from Spain.
Cool.
And there's just all of these individuals that fly under the radar. And to find out that there was an underground railroad that ran from the Southwest to Mexico because they had gotten rid of enslaved people in the 1820s. I bring this into the classroom, where it's appropriate, but I also, that's the story I'm kind of telling. The story of, in some cases, people who are, their only testament they ever existed was something in a newspaper or a headstone. I'd like to do my memoirs. I've led an interesting life, and it's just very, it's hard, because it's, what used to be funny is now kind of painful.
I did my career memoir. I took basically my resume, and I wrote each job backwards, and it was great. But I got a good lesson out of each experience. It was like self-therapy almost. And it did, each memory unlocked another memory. So I like the exercise of memoir writing because it unlocks a lot of things for even you, the writer.
But I had somebody, they're a pretty well-known writer, and they convinced me that, well, what you have so far it's kind of like a stand-up routine. People want to see that somehow you've grown, somehow you've been transformed, like you're saying. And I'm like, well, I'll let you know when that happens. And I don't know, maybe I need a better therapist.
Right. Well, and with comedy, actually, the thing is not to grow. Like, you're supposed to pretend you're going to change, pretend you're going to change, pretend you're going to change. And then the punchline is you're back where you were. You never did. That's how every good joke works.
In the valley, moved up from the city. It's a new way of living, and I'm trying to get used to it. 1 pot noodles, half an ounce of an idiot. Ordered a Manhattan, and they call me a Cidiot. At first I hurt my feelings, but it's kinda got a ring to it. When you move to the country, they can tell when you're new to it. I'm looking at a place, but I'm trying to keep fitting in. It takes too long to be a local, so for now I'm a Cidiot.